Welcome to CoC 201 training series. Hopefully you've tuned in to the CoC 101 training series. And that training series is really to give you the very basics of the continuum of care for anyone who might be connected with the CoC. The CoC 201 training series is going to go a little bit more in depth and will hopefully be a good resource for those of you who are involved with the CoC in terms of decision-making or operations. For example, CoC board members, CoC committee chairs, and anyone else who wants to get a deeper dive into what the CoC is all about. So this module is going to focus on CoC responsibilities. So we covered some about CoC responsibilities in the CoC 101 training series, but to recap, here are some of the key priorities that a CoC should be focusing on, as these are CoC responsibilities that HUD has laid out. So first of all, the CoC has to operate the continuum of care. This includes hosting membership meetings, inviting new members, selecting a board, and appointing committees or work groups. The CoC has to have a governance charter. The CoC also has to have written standards, which are policies and procedures for providing CoC assistance. The CoC has to evaluate performance for programs that receive CoC funds. The CoC must establish and then operate the coordinated entry system, must design and operate the HMIS system, must plan and conduct the point in time count, must coordinate with consolidated plan jurisdictions and ESG recipients, establish a community plan for delivering homeless assistance, basically coordinating with other folks who are getting HUD funds or homeless assistance funds to make sure that the community plan is coordinated, and then also to apply to HUD annually for funding. So we're going to dive into some of these in a bit more depth. So we mentioned in CoC 101 that the collaborative applicant, each CoC has a collaborative applicant. The collaborative applicant acts on behalf of the CoC when applying to HUD for grants, and all responsibilities assigned to the collaborative applicant have to be documented in your CoC's governance charter. So this collaborative applicant is really the one who's making sure that things are submitted to HUD, is applying on behalf of the CoC to HUD for funding. And some of the responsibilities of the collaborative applicant are submitting that annual consolidated application to HUD for funds. I mentioned applying for CoC funds, and participating in the development of the governance charter. So CoC planning activities, all collaborative applicants can get up to 3% of basically their annual funding award for planning. And the planning cost can be used for carrying out that collaborative process for developing the HUD application, evaluating CoC and ESG program outcomes, coordinating with other folks in the CoC, such as the consolidated plan jurisdictions and ESG recipients. And the CoC planning cost can also include basically any activities that are centered around developing your community-wide strategy to address homelessness. You can also use it to evaluate outcomes of projects, including CoC and ESG funded projects, and submitting your application to HUD. And then as well as monitoring, the costs of monitoring both recipients and subrecipients and enforcing compliance. These are all eligible CoC planning costs. So again, the collaborative applicant can get up to 3% of the CoC's annual award and use that for planning activities, which is really just the ins and outs of operating the CoC on a day-to-day basis. So we mentioned that all CoCs have to establish a board. So the CoC board is established by the CoC to act on its behalf. The term "on its behalf" has to be specified in your CoC governance charter. So what are the roles of the board and what will the board be doing in relation to the CoC? The board is different than the collaborative applicant. The collaborative applicant is one entity. It's the entity that's sort of applying to HUD on behalf of the CoC, whereas the board is typically made up of numerous members who are all working together. And we'll talk a little bit in a future module about the makeup of the board. So the board must represent relevant organizations and folks who are serving people experiencing homelessness. The board must include at least one person who is homeless or formerly homeless. And Board members may represent multiple populations of folks, different interests. Maybe someone represents the education system, but also has expertise in working with youth, for example. We'll get more into the Eastern PA CoC board in a future module. We noted that the CoC has to develop a governance charter. So the governance charter, part of what the governance charter does is really outline the functions of key players in the CoC. So what is the role of the board? What is the role of the committees and how are those structured? What is the role of the HMIS lead? What are the role of sort of the staff? So maybe your planning grant pays for staff people who are helping operate the CoC. What are their roles? And then what is your process for updating and amending your charter? The governance charter must also include basically your policies and procedures for how you're going to carry out these various CoC responsibilities. It has to have a code of conduct specific to your board members and also a recusal process for board members. It's important that board members are not engaged in any conflicts of interest, for example, around funding decisions. So that should be outlined in your governance charter. And the governance charter should be reviewed and updated annually. And it's really a collaborative process between your board, your collaborative applicant, and your HMIS lead to update that governance charter. The CoC also needs to establish written standards for providing CoC and ESG assistance. And that should be done in consultation with your ESG recipients. So HUD has some minimum requirements for written standards. Most CoCs do a little bit more than just these basics, but at a minimum, your standards have to have how you're evaluating whether someone is eligible for CoC assistance, how you're prioritizing folks for rapid rehousing, how you're prioritizing folks for transitional housing, what percentage or amount of rent each participant must pay while receiving rapid rehousing. That's a CoC kind of guided decision that should be outlined in your written standards, and how you're going to prioritize folks for PSH. Those are the minimum requirements. However, many CoCs go above and beyond those minimum requirements and really make the written standards more of a guidebook for both CoC and ESG grantees on how to implement their projects in a way that is both compliant with HUD requirements as well as CoC requirements and expectations. A little bit more about the CoC responsibilities. In the Eastern PA CoC specifically, the CoC adopted a 5-year strategic plan in 2017 that really outlined what goals the CoC would be working on over a 5-year period to end homelessness. And that strategic plan is due to be updated in the near future. So the 7 goals that were outlined in the strategic plan is reducing the overall number of people experiencing homelessness in the CoC by 50% by 2021. The CoC is making progress towards this and has seen a decrease from the PIT counts, but is still working towards this goal. And other goals are ending chronic homelessness, ending veterans homelessness, reducing homelessness among families with children, reducing homelessness among unaccompanied youth, setting a path to end all forms of homelessness, reducing the duration of homelessness to an average of 47 days or less. So these are really the driving goals that the Eastern PA CoC is working towards. And these goals are all sort of in progress and continue to be a focus of the CoC. In addition to the goals in the strategic plan, there were strategies. So how is the CoC going to achieve these goals? Some of the strategies were preventing and diverting homelessness, streamlining and coordinating access to housing and services. So how are you going to make sure that your system is accessible and is not overly burdensome for participants or for staff? Expanding the housing options, so continuing to increase resources for people experiencing homelessness. In addition to expanding and aligning resources, so making sure that all the different funding streams and all the different resources are working together really towards those goals we just talked about. Increasing the economic security of households, so helping households increase their earned or non-earned income, accessing community benefits. Increasing the capacity for data collection and analysis, so ensuring that the CoC can run data reports and interpret those data reports so that we know what kind of progress the CoC is making, where are the gaps, where are the needs. So continuing to enhance that capacity. Engaging in advocacy to increase support and sustainability. So working to, in a number of different advocacy ways, whether it's with other systems, to ensure that folks experiencing homelessness have access to the supports they need. And then building a sustainable system and developing the CoC infrastructure so the CoC can really work the most efficiently and effectively as possible. And last for this module, just want to run through who's who. In case you ever hear some of these acronyms or are not sure who are the different players in the Eastern PA CoC, want to break it down for you. So first of all, we have the Eastern PA CoC Governing Board. This board is responsible for oversight of all CoC activities. We also have the RABs, which we talked about in a CoC 101 module, which are the Regional Homeless Advisory Board. Each RAB has 2 co-chairs who are also board members, and these folks are leading those regional level efforts to implement the policies adopted by the CoC and really lead efforts locally to address homelessness. We have DCED, which stands for the Department of Community and Economic Development. DCED is that CoC collaborative applicant, which we talked about, and your CoC HMIS lead agency. DMA, which stands for Diana T. Myers and Associates, is the consultant for DCED, responsible for a lot of these CoC responsibilities, including supporting the CoC board and committees, conducting the annual point in time count and CoC competition activities, and supporting implementation of the strategic plan. And then we also have Capacity for Change, which is another consultant for DCD with a focus on implementing the coordinated entry system. So thank you for joining us for CoC 201, all about CoC responsibilities, and we hope to see you back for the next module.